Hi, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. My name is Rebecca Root, and I am a reporter and senior associate with DevEx. Over the next month or so, I'll be hosting a handful of conversations sponsored by the World Bank and running alongside the World Bank's Fragility Forum 2020 virtual series. And we'll be talking about how to better serve and support some of the world's most vulnerable populations in fragile settings, something which is always incredibly important, but given today with the current pandemic, climate impacts, and current conflicts that we're seeing, it's increasingly becoming more important to have such conversations. So today, for our first conversation, I'm joined by Jonathan Papoulidis, Executive Advisor on Fragile States at World Vision. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
Great. First of all, fragile states, when we're talking Yemen, Somalia, Syria, other places a little bit similar, they're not on track to meet the sustainable development goals. And yet 80% of the world's extreme poor are projected to end up living in these contexts come 2030. How do you think we can change this, if it's even possible?
Yeah, and that projection of 80% is pre-COVID. So right now we're seeing an even worsening situation, as you alluded to. We're seeing 40 million people falling into extreme poverty by the end of this year. We see the World Food Programming talking about 250 million people falling to the brink of starvation by the end of this year as well. So the situation is much worse. It also points to the fact that part of what we need to do to address extreme poverty and move towards the SDGs in these places is trying to get a handle on these complex risks and the knock-on effects that they have, as well as trying to build the resilient capacities of the populations, of states, and of systems. And this is very much where I think the OECD has done a good thing over the last few years in terms of redefining fragility as an imbalance of high risks and lower coping capacities, because it gives us some sense of what we need to be focusing on across a range of domains: political, economic, social, environmental, and security. So we need to figure out ways to do this. And in the aid sector right now, we're really not focused meaningfully on complex risks. We're focusing a lot more on needs, both drive growth and to reduce poverty. And so we need to have a kind of a paradigm shift towards much more of a resilience approach at a country level to see what's really happening there in terms of disruptions and try to figure it out. The World Development Report 2017 that focused on governance, I think, makes this point very well when it says that despite prevailing assumptions that today's most advanced economies and most peaceful economies got there by accelerating growth, it was really much more about managing major crises and setbacks. And so part of this is really coming to the table with a much reconceived approach to fragility, trying to address these risks. The other part, of course, is that we do have to figure out a sort of a growth strategy to support these contexts. And right now, the strategy has really been about kind of one-off deals, trying to make them to support firms, whether domestic firms or international firms. The current head of the World Bank's IFC describes this as whack-a-mole kind of approach, where you're constantly looking at what deals are coming up next and how do you address them, how do you find them, how do you make those deals. And IFC has actually proposed a new way of working, one that's focused on supporting so-called pioneering firms in fragile states, where you have a firm that wants to enter a market and it presents barrier costs. So the pioneering firm approach is to support these firms with their fixed costs and their risks to enter a market, but then to follow very closely behind them and figure out what does the market need for these firms to be successful. What kinds of regulations are necessary? What kinds of political deals are necessary in these very complex political economies? And what kinds of other partners are needed to create industrial complexes, global supply chains, cluster economies? And so this is a really interesting approach, because the premise is that you can't define the regulations, the enabling environment ahead of time. You have to use these kind of firms as canaries in the coal mine towards more strengthening. So I think these two ingredients are really important to take sight of when we're trying to think about poverty reduction and SDGs. The last piece I would say around this is that you need a lot more intensive development cooperation at the country level, sort of joined up approaches around a so-called country platform, where you can really work with governments to achieve the resilience piece as well as the market strengthening piece. And this has to bring in firms, this has to bring in civil society and communities, as well as the range of development partners to do that. I actually have a DevEx op-ed up from earlier this year that lays this piece out a bit. And it's actually fresh off a convening that we did, World Vision DevEx, during the World Economic Forum in Davos. So that's there as well to see.
Great. Yeah, I would definitely encourage people to go and read that piece. It's a great piece. I just wanted to dig into what you said there about that paradigm shift between fragility and conflict and moving towards peace and resilience. Are there some, I know kind of you listed a few there, but are there any like immediate steps that should be taken that perhaps by NGOs or perhaps by governments themselves to really kind of accelerate that progress in the right direction?
Yeah, we're really at a crossroads right now in development paradigms in terms of engaging fragile states. And I think it plays out on 5 fronts. The first front is we need a shift from sort of a needs-based only approach to engaging these places to a complex risk approach, as I mentioned. The other piece is that we need an approach to projects and program interventions that is much more adaptive to the situation, much more adaptive to shocks and stress from conflict and disasters and pandemics, etc., and much more adaptive to the context itself. Again, these are very complex political economies, and you really only learn how to work through them by doing so. And right now, you see a lot of mainstream aid that is dealing with preconceived solutions and very straitjacketed metrics and timelines for how those solutions are to be implemented. So there's very little room to work, and that's and adapt. And that's very much not fit for purpose. The other element is this sort of need to move from firms and one-off deals to market strengthening. We also need to have a kind of renewed approach to scaling. It's incredible that not many interventions across development really go to scale. And I've argued with a colleague, Larry Cooley at MSI, that this is because we've come to the idea of scaling in a backward way. We think of scaling as a secondary process. When you have a winning pilot project or a breakthrough innovation, then you think, how do we scale it? And in fact, scaling is much more of an organizing framework to meet a development outcome, not to implement a project. And in that framework, you try to blend partners and resources and different project innovations and models to achieve that outcome. And this allows you to differentiate what works in a rural area or disaster-prone area or an urban area or a conflict area. We've seen some of this happen in Afghanistan with the basic package on health services, which created sort of an ecosystem of scaling. And it didn't define it based on just one particular intervention. There was a basic packages of health interventions, and partners were able to use their own models to achieve outcomes. Afghanistan actually met its MDG goal of cutting infant and maternal mortality in half by 2015 as a result of this. So I think we need to rethink scaling as well. And finally, we really need to think about how we cooperate on the ground a lot more. Right now, there's a lot of disjointed efforts around smaller projects, and it overwhelms the capacities of communities and governments to deal with competing programs and interests and requests. And we need a lot more consolidated front, one kind of centralized point of gravity to make decisions and blend finances and cooperate. So I think we need to move in this direction. I did a piece a few years ago with George Ingram at the Brookings Institution called The Search for What's Work, and we kind of highlight the need to move from the current way of working to this kind of new place that we're not quite there yet on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know, and I know you're not alone in a lot of your thinking, because World Vision and DevEx partnered earlier in the year, and we did a survey where we found that 75% of people think adopting a fragility to resilience agenda is really crucial to achieving the SDGs. And I guess some of the things you've already mentioned would be key components of such an agenda, but is there anything else that you think organizations and governments should be factoring in when they're putting such an agenda together?
Right. Yeah, that survey was really interesting, because I think 75% of respondents said that we really need this shift from fragility to resilience. And you can really see a lot of organizations moving in this direction. The World Bank has its first fragility strategy, and you see a really multi-dimensional focus on resilience, from the rule of law and governance sector to disaster and health, etc. So that's very promising. I think the OECD has done a lot of leadership in this space, redefining fragility, creating a fragility framework of countries that are measured basically based on their resilience to different kinds of risks and fragilities. The African Development Bank has a fragility to resilience strategy. So there's been a lot of forward motion. We've seen this in USAID and others as well. The piece that I think is outstanding, the piece that sort of needs more development, is around what we might call political resilience or institutional resilience. And the idea here is around how can new economic or political challengers within a particular fragile state enter that arena without collapsing the system itself into conflict or just disarray. And so typically this is the preserve of sort of the political settlements discourse. This is the preserve of the kind of conflict prevention community, the peace building community. And we need to link it a lot more to the full cycle of resilience, such that how do we deal with making these institutions and political settlements more adaptive? And then if that fails, how do we better deal with the risks that that creates for populations from very close political settlements that then don't have, these populations then don't have access to services, social protections and rights. It makes them very vulnerable to disasters, to conflict, to pandemics, etc. And then we need to link it to then how do you better manage those crises by building up sort of the three hallmarks of resilience capacities. These are absorptive capacity, adaptive capacity, and transformative capacity. I think the donor that has done the most work in trying to connect these dots, from trying to create more political resilience, institutional resilience, and all the way through to what you then do when risks emerge, and then how you deal with crisis, is the European Union. They have the so-called strategic approach to resilience that is very much trying to be informed by political realities. And I think we can begin to crowd in other types of resources and thinking from DFID's work, for example, on elite bargains and political settlements, from the work of the Political Settlements Consortia at the University of Edinburgh. The World Development Report has done a lot of work on governance, has done a lot of work on when the conditions are right for moving to more inclusive political settlements and when they're not, and how you try to navigate these kind of power asymmetries that they talk about. So I think this is the piece that's still outstanding. The Pathways report that the World Bank did with the UN on going to peace, the kind of pathways to peace, also uses this kind of resilience lens about how to manage these kind of political and institutional risks. And it actually says that resilience through the SDGs or through development is the best means of prevention. So there are these strands out there. We need to connect them to the more kind of established sectors of resilience in food security, in climate, in disaster risk reduction, and then kind of make sure everyone's kind of moving collectively in this direction. Mm-hmm. Fascinatingly, as Katie Peters has shown at ODI, the majority of disaster risk reduction financing doesn't go to fragile states. It goes to other countries. And so this is what I mean when I say that there is a real gap in terms of us moving to this much more sophisticated approach from fragility to resilience. And this needs to be sped up.
Mm-hmm. Despite these gaps that you've identified, do these agendas give you some level of confidence that change is possible even prior to that 2030 deadline?
Yes, I think so. Because if you look at any of these fronts that I mentioned, we have to move forward on, we are seeing increased commitments. Two that I would mention is one, that when it comes to greater development cooperation at the country level, we've seen the World Bank and the G20 and UNDP and others committing to strengthening these so-called country platforms on the ground, where governments can work better with partners and society to find solutions. And I think this has really been missing, and it's led to kind of a very fragmented approach. So I'm optimistic about that front. The other piece that I'm optimistic about is this shift that we're seeing towards more adaptive management approaches. The Global Fragility Act that the US Congress passed recently talks explicitly about needing more adaptive approaches to the US government's work in this space. And it also couples that with the need for more country level coordination as well. And so I think we're moving in the right direction, but it will take a long time, right? This is the work of generations. I think the former British Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, said it best. And he said that when it comes to strengthening the rule of law, the first 500 years is the hardest. Right? So we shouldn't be any illusions that this is a very long-term process, but we can put into place more sensitive, adaptive, and joined-up approaches to international work in this space that make us more attentive to tipping points, looming crisis, conflict, and better placed to then take advantage of opportunities to help accelerate more peaceful, inclusive shifts forward.
Mm-hmm. But just picking up what you said prior about money not necessarily going to the places where it's most needed, how much will that jeopardize progress, and how can we get the money where it's most needed in place?
This is really where I think a lot of donor support is necessary, and it needs to be a lot more joined up. This connects back to things like scalable solutions, where in Afghanistan you had this approach to the basic package on health services that pooled lots of donor resources together to power it. A lot of budgets in fragile states from governments are very weak, and so they don't have the resources to do this. And so the question is, how do you get the best bang for your buck? How do you actually create programs that are more resilient, more flexible, more enduring? And USAID, I think, has been doing some really interesting work on this in the health space, trying to create more resilient health systems in fragile places, not just looking at community disaster support, but really trying to work at a systems level. I recently did a piece for the New Humanitarian on 5 ways to build resilience in health systems. And I think these are the kinds of solutions that we need to be looking at a lot more. And again, this requires more joined up approaches on the ground to be thinking about this, and not just meeting needs, but really focusing on what are the complex risks that could disrupt your development operation as well as humanitarian operation.
Mm-hmm. And something you touched upon already when talking about this coordination element is this idea of country platforms. And I know that, as you mentioned, the World Bank's first ever strategy focused on fragility, conflict, and violence actually mentions these, but there has been some previous uncertainty as to their value. How do you think such coordination mechanisms might be able to help?
So these mechanisms are one of the greatest paradoxes in aid, because they're the most invisible. We've been doing, as an aid community, these kind of platforms by different names and shapes over the last 20 years. In places like Liberia, where I first experienced them in 2003, when I was in UN peacekeeping, to Afghanistan, to Haiti, to Somalia. And yet, despite the fact that they keep getting repeated, there's no doctrine on what we're learning, how to guide them, how to make them better. And so we're now beginning to see a really positive move to strengthening these mechanisms, really investing in them, not just making them something that you did on the ground as a way of sort of transacting knowledge or making specific decisions. So at base, despite the variety in these types of forms, we can kind of see a basic model that underlies them. The first is that there's always some kind of high-level steering group where you have the president or prime minister of the country joined by principals at the donor level, civil society representation, implementing partner representation. And this is sort of the body where you have a policy dialogue around what's working and what's not. You try to troubleshoot sort of big ticket items in terms of opportunities and sort of tipping points. Below that, you have a sort of sector level where ministers of health and education and energy and infrastructure can bring together their core group of partners, as well as their investors, and then representatives from society as well, to think through sector policy. How are we going to move the sector forward given very limited coping capacities and resources? And below that, you have a secretariat, usually led by the Ministry of Planning, that embeds international experts with local experts and administers to the functioning of this platform, but also does troubleshooting, does trend analysis and progress reports as well to keep things moving. And we've seen in places like Somalia, through increased assessments, that this has been sort of one of the key features propelling the country forward in very difficult circumstances. So I think this is really one of the places where if you don't have it, you really don't have a center of gravity from which to work. You have a sea, again, of these very piecemeal project interventions that aren't really working or fit for purpose in the face of breakdowns in institutions, markets, and social cohesion.
Well, I could ask you a million more questions about this, but what would your one call to action be for governments, say, working in amongst these coordination bodies or NGOs? What do you think they should be thinking about or trying to do when moving from fragility to resilience?
So in Somalia, for example, we lead a consortium called the Somali Resilience Program, SOMREP. And it's been there for 15 years, but it's always been very grassroots in its orientation. So it's a scaling consortia that works on resilience across the country with farmer associations, with women's groups, with other civil society members, communities. But increasingly, it's been reorienting itself to this country platform and trying to support both district and national level planning on resilience, and then participating in the fora itself to inject its insights, its learnings into what's working and what's not in this space. And I think that's the way to approach this across sort of the aid community on the ground. Think of this as a place for injecting your knowledge, learning what's going on, looking at where the government wants to go, hearing from civil society and others in terms of what adjustments are necessary, and then using it to program. So I would almost say that anybody working in these places, in terms of a call to action, should be doing three things in their sort of fragility strategy. The one is to include a risk landscape. If you're only thinking about the needs that you're trying to meet in the health sector or the water sector or what have you, you're missing the complex interaction of risks that can really disrupt that work. So really be sensitive to risks. The second is to really consider a more adaptive strategy. So hold your outcomes as fixed, but don't fix the pathways for getting there. Be really open to change. There's an increasingly fashionable or important approach to this work called the portfolio approach that recommends that donors and other large aid agencies look at all the pieces of their portfolio, see what's working and what's not, and be able to flexibly reallocate funding and technical support to areas that show promise, so that these can be flexibly sort of bolstered at a time when they're needed. And the last piece is what I just mentioned, the idea that you should be factoring in what is existing on the ground. Is there a country platform? And if so, how do you input into it? This has become commonplace for a lot of humanitarians, where they look now for the humanitarian cluster system, as it's called, where they ask, is there this humanitarian system on the ground where we can plug into and coordinate around? But we see very little of that happening at these other levels of the country platforms that are working on the really big issues of peace and development. And so any strategy should be really thinking about, how do we participate in these, how do we inform these, and how do we get our priorities from those as well.
Great, thank you. I love that, really tangible, concrete steps that people can take forward. So thank you so much, and thank you for joining us and for sharing all of your expertise with us today. For those of you at home, you can keep watching to see further conversations upcoming over the next month. And in the meantime, you're welcome to join in the conversation just by leaving a comment below or going to Facebook and Twitter and tagging at DevX. Thank you very much.